We're calling tonight's Veritas Forum event here at UCCS, Is Science Enough? Faith, Facts, and Fundamental Truths. This event is sponsored by CRU at UCCS and by the Center for Religious Diversity and Public Life. It is also co-sponsored by Chi Alpha and Ecclesia. Now, for a little bit of information about tonight's event is not a debate. We are not here to see anyone win or lose or score points off of one another. The word veritas is Latin for truth. So we're here tonight for a real discussion, connecting truth to our hardest questions and our deepest beliefs. We have asked our presenters to share with us tonight personally and to ask honest questions of each other and model a conversation for all of us that we can all continue this evening and beyond. Our hope is that everyone in this room would be challenged. For those of you who are here who identify as Christians, we hope you will be challenged by both of our presenters to examine your faith with intellectual honesty and rigor. For those of you who think of the Christian faith as mystifying, irrelevant, or disproved, we hope you will be challenged by hearing from a Christian intellectual who can make a serious case for why faith in Jesus makes sense. The Veritas planning team aims to create events that are relevant, thought-provoking, and engaging to people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and we need your help with that tonight. So, if you wouldn't mind, please pick up the Veritas 60-second survey card. I have one right here. Also beneath your seats, you'll notice a small pencil. Please grab that as well. And we'd like to take just 15 seconds just to fill out that top half of the front side, just in that light sage green. And I'm actually going to fill it out too. Now, note we will only use your email address to send you a link to an online feedback site where you can share your thoughts on tonight's forum. That's all we'll be using your email address for if you give us your card. We really do want your feedback. We want to make these Veritas Forum events as good as they can be. Also, we will not email you about anything else unless you check one of the boxes at the bottom of the card, or, please note, unless you want to win a raffle for a new iPad. We will definitely need your email for that. So, after the conversation, please fill out the remaining sections of the card, and we'll actually be gathering those at the back by the door. So if you wouldn't mind leaving those with the ushers as you leave. So, our format tonight will consist of the following. Each of our two speakers will have 15 minutes to share from their perspective on the nature of faith, facts, and fundamental truths. Then they will have a conversation with one another for about 30 minutes. And after that, all of you will have the opportunity to ask your questions in a Q&A session with the speakers. And if you do have a question, please meet me down here at this microphone, and you can ask your question of our speakers. After all of that, after about roughly an hour and a half, so hopefully by 9:30, maybe slightly before, we will be having a reception. There are some treats and some drinks back there, so please, our speakers will be available to chat with afterwards, so please stick around for some food and some drink. Now I'd like to invite up Dr. Jeff Dunn. Dr. Dunn is Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual here at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, where he teaches courses on American political institutions, constitutional law, and political theory. His research primarily focuses on constitutional history and judicial policy making. He previously taught at the College of William and Mary and was a fellow in contemporary history, public policy, and American politics at the Miller Center of Public Affairs in Charlottesville, Virginia. Please welcome up Dr. Dunn.
All right, well, I have the privilege of moderating tonight and to also introduce our speakers. Before doing that, I do want to thank the Veritas Forum for allowing me to moderate this discussion tonight. I think I first attended a Veritas Forum event maybe 18 years ago, and I think the great value of what the Veritas Forum does is that it brings together people of different perspectives and asks them to discuss questions of deep and fundamental importance in both a respectful and spirited way, and I expect that we'll have that kind of discussion tonight. So I'm actually going to introduce our second speaker first, Dr. Jeff Scholes. He's my friend and colleague here at UCCS. Before saying anything more about him, I also want to say that he's one of the nicest guys you'll meet at UCCS. Despite that, I still expect the conversation to be spirited. We know it will be respectful. But he's an assistant professor of philosophy here at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. He earned his BA from Baylor University, his Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and his PhD at the University of Denver, where he focused on the intersection of religion and American culture. He's written for the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture and other publications. He's also the director for the Center for Religious Diversity in Public Life. That's also an institution here at UCCS which does really excellent work bringing speakers to campus to discuss these kinds of questions. His areas of interest and research and teaching include Christianity and political economy, material religion and culture, and religion and sports. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Josh Swamidas. After having dinner with him, I can also report that he's a nice guy, but also that the conversation will be spirited. We've already solved many political problems. Jeff and Josh have ironed out a lot of things from the midterm elections, so they could also discuss that for you. But he is an assistant professor at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, having earned his medical degree and computer science PhD at the University of California at Irvine. He's the author of How Deep Is Your Dungeon? It's an artful engagement with the biblical story of Job and the nature of human suffering. He has spent much time volunteering in medical projects in Mexico, India, and the United States. And as a scientist and Christian, he often wonders about the synergies and tensions between faith and science. His current research focuses on designing computational infrastructure, it's hardware, data, and algorithms that can help experimental researchers discover and refine novel medicines. So please join me in welcoming Josh to the stage.
Hear me? All right. Yes. All right. So thanks. First of all, I just want to thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's a real privilege to be here. It's been great interacting with the student leaders and the faculty here. It's just a great opportunity. I was asked to come and share my answer to the question, is science enough? And that's a pretty important question to me because I've essentially devoted my life to science. I mean, I don't know about what happens after I die, but at least while I'm here. That's what my career is, and so it really is important for me as I think about this, is science enough? But before I get into that, I just want to explain to you a little bit more about who I am and why I might actually have something to say about this. I'm going to do that by just telling you a little bit about my path. So I was a pre-med undergraduate at the University of California, Irvine, meaning that I wanted to be like a physician treating patients. And as you can see, that's not what happened. So I was a little bit of a confused undergrad. Can anyone identify with that? All right, there you go. I did that for 4 years. My degree was actually in biology, but I was also doing a computer science minor and was really torn back and forth between doing medicine and not doing it. And really, what kind of sealed the deal and what I would do my residency in was what happened during my junior year when I actually spent a little bit of time doing research, basically because I'm required to go to medical school. But I kind of got mugged by science, because it was totally engaging. Like I had spent so many time in science classes where I was learning about scientific facts, which is interesting enough, but when you actually start doing research, it's about forging off into the unknown and discovering new facts. And that was totally different and totally engaging. So I did what any smart person who's thinking about medicine but doesn't know really what they want to do. I did an MD PhD program, which they say is for smart people who really don't know what they want to do in the future. It allows you to postpone every important decision in your life for 9 years. And so I spent 9 years in graduate school. So I started when I was 21 and I graduated when I was 30. That was basically my entire 20s. And my PhD was in computer science. And I think a PhD, really what it is, a PhD in science at least, is it's an opportunity to really spend time deeply invested in a field and find out if you're going to fall in love with it. Because there's really no point in being a scientist if you're not in love with what you're studying. Because there's so much work involved in it, so much uncertainty, and there's so much better ways to make money and to have flexibility in your life that if you don't love it, you really probably shouldn't go down that career, but you don't really know before you get into graduate school, so you're kind of there. But that's what happened to me. I really fell in love with science during my PhD. But still, I was torn because I was still, a pre-med I went to medical school and all that. So I ended up still becoming a pathology resident. And this ended up being Washington University in St. Louis. It only lasted a year. I got offered a job as a professor, and a long story short, I started as a professor at Washington University about 4 years ago. I've been a professor there for 4 years. And I have to tell you, it is such a privilege to get paid to get up in the morning and go do something that I would do for free, that I love. I just love the idea of going out and figuring out new things about the world out there that aren't known yet. It's not going down the highway. It's kind of going and like bushwhacking and going off and finding that trail up into the misty mountains where maybe I might find something cool. And I know it's riskier and it's scarier, but I mean, how cool is it that I get to do that for a job? So that's kind of where I come from in all of this, and that's kind of my starting point in this entire discussion. I will put up one science slide just so you understand what it I do is, for example, just to get a sense of that. If you don't like science, just go with me for a moment. So, like for example, this is a drug. It's Tylenol, and it gets changed by your body into molecules that can make it toxic. We're really interested one of the things our lab is doing is trying to find computer programs that can understand the patterns to figure out when that happens for new drugs. When, based on the molecule structure, it's going to actually get metabolized into a toxic molecule. If we can do that, it could help us discover new medications that are much safer than the ones that are on the market, and maybe help people avoid those drugs that could be really dangerous. So that's what we do. It's very, deep into the nuts and bolts and technical science. I'm happy to talk to you about. I could talk to you about that for hours, but we're not going to do that now. All right. So that's kind of, I've told you my relationship with science. Let me tell you a little bit more now about kind of what science is, and that's going to be important as we next get into what I think, really answering that question of is science enough. So what is science? And now, I will point out that this is a very controversial question. If you get 10 people up here, you'll probably get 20 different answers. And it's also very passionate because you're going to have people really arguing about what actually it is, because there's a lot of credibility that comes with science, and they want to make sure that whatever they're doing is considered science. With that being said, I'm going to give out my definition and tell you that there's a little bit of a continuum. Not everything perfectly fits it, but that's just at least the starting point of what I mean when I say science. I'll say that it's an experimental way of finding a specific type of truth. And that specific type of truth is mechanistic explanations of the physical world that are observable and repeatable while trusting prior scientific work and in communication with the scientific community and motivated by a passion to know. That's my definition of science. And all of those words were chosen very carefully. Let me say it again, because this is going to be kind of important in kind of the next few slides. It's experimentally finding a specific type of truth, and that's a mechanistic explanation of the physical world that are observable. That explanation is observable, it's repeatable, and it's in the context of trusting prior scientific work and communicating with the scientific community and being motivated by a deep passion to understand how things work. All right, are you guys tracking with me there? Now, you might disagree with pieces of this, and certainly a lot of things that we consider science don't 100% fit into this. I would just say this is the gold standard. Maybe if one of those things isn't there, it could still be science. But the farther and farther you get away from this, the more and more you wonder if it really is science. And the point I will make first about this and why this can be so controversial and debated is because science has a lot of cultural credibility. It cuts across politics, it cuts across cultures, it cuts across religions. Basically, from the starting point, most people really want to see what they're doing as scientific. You add the scientific modifier to something, people think it's more trustworthy. And the reason why is that science has worked surprisingly well. Really, in the short a couple hundred years that we've been rigorously applying modern science, we have made profound discoveries in the world. We have discovered things like computers. I mean, it's just impossible. This is like a magical machine that, how would you even describe to people what an iPad was, 100 years ago? It would have been inconceivable, right? Things like even your car, the fact that we put people onto the moon, and I don't know if you followed the news, but just today, they landed a rover on a comet for the first time. That's absurd. Just think about the ridiculousness of that. Also, things like vaccines and what we understand in medical science, so we actually know what the human genetic code is. And things as crazy as nuclear power, that we're actually splitting the atom. I mean, as great as other fields of study are, none of them have this type of claim to credibility and building things in the real world. And that's, I think, why that becomes very controversial, why this definition becomes controversial, and why it's really important. Now, I think given those things, some people go the step farther to say, well, because nothing really compares with science in making this type of effect in the world, maybe that's all we need. And I don't think that's the case. And that gets to kind of this question again, and why even this question arises. Because some people would argue that all you really need is science to discover the important things in this world. And I would say no, that actually science is not enough. And I would say because there are some important truths that are either not physical, not repeatable, or not observable, or maybe not even all three of these, but they're still important. And if there's an important truth that exists that is not these things, science does not have a way of even really asking the question. And I'm going to give you some examples in a moment of things that I think fell into that category. And if you agree with me that they're important, and that there's no way you can design a scientific experiment to address it, maybe you'll agree with me then that science is not enough. So here's the first category of thing I'll put up. Historical facts. Historical facts are not scientific facts, but I would argue that they are real and they're important. Let me give you an example of one just like that. Hitler systematically exterminated Jews, murdering 6 million people in the Holocaust. Does everyone agree with that? That that's a truth? I hope you would also agree that's a very important truth. Because if we don't believe that's important, if we don't believe it's true, we really risk having that history repeat itself. And that would be a horrible thing. Also, if we choose to reject that truth, it also implies something about what our internal beliefs are. So, at the same time, that fact is actually not scientific. It's not directly observable or repeatable. There's no experiment I can do to prove to you that the Holocaust actually happened. Now, that doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen. It's still a truth that's important, that's actually there. It's just that we don't approach it, we don't establish it by science alone. Because it's a historical fact, it's supported by testimony, documents, artifacts, and yes, some scientific facts, but that's not what seals the deal. There's certain scientific facts that might come along with this, like you might carbon date a document, for example, but that's not actually the primary reasoning. It's not a scientific process that brings us to the point of believing that that's a true fact. So that's one category of things that is not scientific, but it's important, and there's no way to approach scientifically alone. All right, let me give you another one that I hope you will find is important as well, and hard to approach scientifically. Morality and ethics. Science doesn't answer the question ever of, is this the right thing to do? I'm going to give you a few examples along this line of scientific things that have come up where you can really see this issue exposed. The first one is a nuclear bomb. So science tells us how to make a nuclear bomb, but it can't tell us, there's no experiment that we can imagine that will tell us how to ethically use a nuclear bomb. If you can come up with one, I'd be really curious to see how you do it. But there's no scientific process by which we can come up with the morality to understand how to use a nuclear bomb. But we can certainly figure out how to make one. This kind of really exposes the difference between scientific truth and that. Now, you might wonder, maybe there isn't any true moral way of doing that. But we can get to some other issues, too, where at least I think most people would agree here in this room that it's wrong in like a fundamental sense. The other one is like sterilization in the eugenics movement. Now, the point I'm making here is not that there were scientists involved in the eugenics movement, even though they were, but it's more fundamental. So from science, we figured out basically how to sterilize people surgically or chemically. But what happened in about 100 years ago, a lot of people kind of took that knowledge to say, well, maybe what we should be doing then is actually sterilizing people that have undesirable qualities. Like if they're not that smart, maybe we should sterilize them. Or maybe if they have darker colored skin, we should sterilize them. And people are actually doing this. This was most expressed actually in Germany, right, where the eugenics movement went into full flower, right? That's actually what motivated actually throwing people and killing them. But what they were actually doing too is taking mentally retarded people and forcibly sterilizing them. Now, they actually thought what they were doing was morally good, right? Because they thought they were doing something that was good for the human race, even if it wasn't good for this individual person. Now, we look back now on that, and we think it was horrible. It was an incredible abuse, that it was wrong. And I'll just point out that there's no way to come to that conclusion from science. Any strong conclusion we have against eugenics does not come from science. In fact, science is neutral as to what the morality of that is. All it does is provide the tools to enable it, which is kind of scary if all we think, if only science is the way we can come to know things, then all it's going to do is provide tools that can be abused from an ethical and moral point of view, and I think that can be very scary. Another example along these lines is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where African Americans were intentionally infected with syphilis to see what would happen if you don't treat syphilis. That's crazy. We look back in that and think that that was racist, it was wrong, it was even evil, and it happened here in this country, in the United States. But there's nothing in science that restrains us from that. There's no scientific method to figure out if that's right or wrong. In fact, from a scientific point of view, it was scientists that were leading it, and their motivation was curiosity. And the curiosity led to them to do incredibly unethical things. And I'll point out, too, that some deeply immoral leaders aggressively try and replace religion, morality, and culture with science for this very reason. Because if you can really replace all forms of knowing truth with just science alone, then you have the more freedom and latitude when it comes to doing things that would otherwise be considered unethical. All you have to do is look at regimes like the communist regime with Stalin, with Hitler, to see that pattern played out over and over again. Now, once again, I'm not saying that science promotes these things. It's just that science has no safeguards against these things. There's no way to come to know ethics and morality through science alone. Now, the final point I want to kind of throw out there, and this is kind of where it comes from my Christian faith and explains another example of something that I think is true, but you can't approach purely from a scientific path. And this is the resurrection. So the fundamental claim, I don't know what you've heard about what the fundamental claim of Christianity is, but it's not that he created the earth in 6 days. I promise you that that's not the fundamental claim of Christianity. It's not, that there's certain laws that need to be in the books about abortion or gay marriage. That's not the fundamental thing about Christianity. The fundamental truth about Christianity, the center of it all, which is the most necessary and maybe even sufficient to be Christian, is this fact about Jesus, that he was a historical person that was crucified and then physically rose from the dead. You can reject everything in Christianity and still come to be a Christian if you can come to terms with that fact. And if you accept everything else in Christianity and reject this one, I don't know if you're really a Christian. I'll point out that this is not a scientific claim. There is no way to construe this as a scientific claim. A key point in the story is that there is no physical mechanism. It's not that the claim is that there is some physical mechanism out there that if we understood, anyone could rise from the dead. The whole point is that because there's no physical mechanism, we can be all the more certain that it was God's intervention in history. So that, once again, the fact that we're claiming, the claim is that that the physical laws are being broken in this one time in history, puts it outside the realm of science. The claim is, too, that this is a singular event. It's not that if you become a Christian that he will resurrect you in 3 days and we can just observe this. So I can just kind of repeatedly kill my Christian friends and see what happens in 3 days. I mean, if that was the case, then maybe I could actually approach this scientifically because I could do that experiment. Or maybe it might be more ethical to do, sorry, I'm getting to my time. I'm almost done. And I would just say that it's neither directly observable. It's not scientific. That doesn't mean that we can't approach it. We just have to use more than science to approach it, and I would say more historical means. And with that, I will be done, and I'll leave my science slide up. Thanks a lot, guys. Just on time.
PowerPoint, so good. Is it on? You can hear. Great. Thank you. I'm Jeff Scholes, as Josh introduced us before. I want to start by thanking the Veritas Forum for putting this event on. As we talked about, I actually asked at dinner, like, exactly what is Veritas Forum? I hadn't heard of it before until my student Ben Whitman, so I should also recognize Ben, who invited me to do this. And anyway, through our discussion at dinner, the fact that fruitful dialogue is what's ideally the end game of these discussions is very encouraging to me. As we all know from debates, whether it's a creationist versus an evolutionist, that Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate, for instance, I'm not sure what was accomplished out of that. So anyway, I'm glad to know this is not going to be a contentious debate. So hopefully fruitful dialogue will emerge from it, and that the questions that you guys ask eventually will hopefully foster that as well. So anyway, thanks to Veritas and to UCCS for hosting and for all the technology that we have. I was not told that I could use a PowerPoint, so I just have some notes here that I'm going to read off. And I actually wanted to go second because I thought my notes were a little more thin, so I could kind of at least listen to Josh and maybe develop what I'm going to say to some extent off of that. I'll start by saying that as a professor here, and particularly a professor of religious studies, classes I teach world religions, for instance, every semester, for those of you that have taken that class with me, I'm not only reluctant, but I'm adamant about not confessing what I do or do not believe, and I'm going to try to not do that here as well. At the same time, too, either through my educational trajectory, which I'll say something about since Josh did, and also probably from answers to questions that I give, it'll probably betray something of that, but I'm just not going to come out right out and say that. Hopefully we understand why. Maybe you don't, but I can explain later if you have a question about that. I was a science major, a biology and chemistry major at Baylor University as an undergrad, pre-med, intending to go to medical school. My uncle was a cardiologist, and that was the dream of mine since I was probably 11 years old. As my uncle sat me down my junior year of college and said, just to let you know, there's some changes in the medical profession that you need to know about. In particular, there's a lot more red tape that I am dealing with as a cardiologist now. It's still a great profession. You'd be a great doctor. Don't necessarily reject it, but just keep this in mind that the profession itself is changing. So as a result, bear that in mind. And that planted a kind of a seed of doubt in me. So I thought maybe a PhD in science. So I worked in an immunology lab in Dallas, where I'm from, for a couple years. Saw how research was done. There was a lot of red tape there as well. And I was always interested in religion and theology, all throughout college, all through high school, junior high. And I had a friend that was attending Princeton Seminary who had just graduated from Baylor. And I went up to visit him. He said, why don't you come and visit? At that time, I don't think it's true anymore, but at Princeton, they would cover your tuition if you got in. And at the time, they were allowing students in that weren't necessarily going down the ministerial track. I think that's changed to some extent, but it was that way back then. So it seemed like a less risky proposition to start there. And I went to a lecture of one of his classes and saw a professor giving a lecture. And I knew within about 5 seconds, like, that's what I want to do. So that began the process of me starting Princeton Seminary within about a year, I guess, of that point, doing a Master of Divinity. And we were allowed to take classes at Princeton University as well. I took a lot of philosophy courses there. And then started at the University of Denver doctoral program and the Isle School of Theology. It's a joint PhD program through the Religious Studies Department and the Philosophy Department at DU and the Theology Department at the Isle School of Theology. And here I am at UCCS teaching. In the Philosophy Department, teaching almost exclusively all of the Religious Studies courses. So at a state university, which carries with it different kinds of concerns on how religion is talked about and what kinds of things are allowed. If I was at a religious school, world religion school would probably be taught a little bit differently. So you can probably tell from my trajectory, well, maybe actually you can't. I think given that, it looks like from science to religion, but anyway, I'll keep you guessing to some extent. So kind of what Josh did, I think when we're asked this question, is science enough? It's not only trying to get at what we're talking about when we say science, but what is the enough part? Enough for what? And Josh kind of parsed out that it's limited in many ways, and he and I are in complete agreement with that. I mean, science clearly is not enough on just basic things on, deciding what school to go to, deciding who to marry. These are big, big questions that if you apply the scientific method to try to figure that out, and then again along the repeatable aspect of it, it's probably, hopefully, with the marriage question, not going to work very well. Although there are people that probably do apply a scientific method to some degree. Larry King being one of them. And I guess he's been successful in number 8. I don't know. But, right, so there's so many questions. In fact, most of the questions that you deal with on a daily basis are not driven by the scientific method and the way in which scientists think about accessing, as Josh was calling, the truth about it. So the scientific method is one way to talk about science. It's that method that is applied rigorously that Josh talked about, so I won't reiterate it. Another thing to think about is the word science. When we say the word science, as Josh is alluding to as well, we have to ask ourselves what we mean by it. What is the meaning of that word? As opposed to this thing, if we call it a thing, it's deployed in a whole host of different ways. I wrote down a couple of ways in which it gets deployed, and if I say it, I'm talking about science. So for instance, science, won the battle with religion. Some would say that. Or the battle over religion. Science has replaced religion as an explanatory model, right? Some would say, back in the day, if you thought a disease was caused by demons, or that you sinned and therefore you got a disease, that was a religious, quasi-theological explanation for what we now know can be explained very quickly by science. Your strep throat was caused by a bacteria, and the medication needs to cure that is not necessarily through prayer, although people still do that, but you better get to a doctor and get antibiotics quickly. Take a sip of water. Another way to talk about it is that science, it has too much power. It's another way to talk about it. What is it that you're talking about? It's a little unclear, but that term is deployed in different ways to say something. It has too much power over society. Republicans are against it. I'm not necessarily agreeing with this. Liberals are for it, right? What is it? Science is what's being talked about, but it's really unclear exactly what's meant by that, okay? So it has political cachet sometimes. It can tell me how my car works or why a hurricane hit, but it can't tell me where I go when I die and where the universe came from, for instance, all right? There's another way in which science is deployed. The reason I'm talking about this is that underneath the method, the scientific method, the results, the scientific community, the list that Josh put up there, there's also the way in which this term is deployed in culture, the way we use it in language. Can science do all these things that I'm attributing to it in its deployment, right? Probably not, but it's used in that way in culture, in a certain kind of way we talk about language. So I want to just kind of clarify, I am much more concerned about its use as a term in society as opposed to trying to get at what it, quote, really is. I'm not quite sure we can ever do that, okay? So two other things as well. I trust that the question, is science enough, assumes that since the Enlightenment and since the rise of reason in science, many have come to rely on science, as Josh says, for its explanatory power, as if science has hedged out other explanatory models, religious ones in particular, right, to describe the world. If you look at Copernicus and Darwin, these are two major scientific thinkers that have troubled religious worldviews for centuries. Some find accommodation with those two, that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and that we are evolving from earlier primates. These are difficult things that for some don't go here with the Bible, therefore you go fundamental and think the Bible is still the scientific accurate way of explaining how we got here and who we are. Others have found ways to accommodate that, okay? So we can kind of get into that as well, hopefully. But that science can't explain everything is a part embedded, I think, assumed within the question. And as I said before, and Josh did too, it can't. So I'm completely agreeing with that. It begs this other question as well, though. What else, for instance, religion, then steps in to explain some of the things that science can't do? And it's certainly an important question that we'll certainly get to. If we ask which it that I kind of laid out here, science that we're talking about, then we're not really talking about the scientific method, scientific findings, scientists, the whole thing that we kind of consider to be real science, but we're asking more about how is this term being used out in culture. I think this is an interesting question to at least ask. And when we acknowledge this, we're really admitting that we're talking about cultural expression, and really in particular language. And I want to say this because I am, this is a little bit of my worldview, I suppose. I'm an adherent to what's called in philosophy the linguistic turn. And in the linguistic turn, it's admitted by philosophers in the 19th and then 20th century that the truth of something is really contained within a proposition. It's only sentences or statements that are true or false. Grass is green, the sky is blue, the world is round, Hitler systematically killed 6 million Jews. These are propositions that are either true or false, right? The question with the linguistic turn is then, what is it referring to? And can you make a connection between that proposition, what you're saying, which is either true or false, right? You may not be able to discover whether it's true or false, but at least it's a proposition that has veracity or falsity within it. But what is it referring to? And I think oftentimes when we say there's truth out there, I would be nervous about that kind of talk, right? I want to look at the truth of propositions, but trouble the relationship between what is being said in a proposition and then what is purportedly referring to, as if there's a correspondence between the two. True statement corresponding to true reality, something out there. So we can kind of discuss this as well. I trust this will be a point of contention between us. Maybe not. I don't know. I also want to say this as well, regards religion and science, then I'll be done. My colleague, who actually is here in the crowd, Raphael Sassauer, and I we wrote a book on religion and sports, but we just wrote an article that's going to come out in a journal on religion and science. And in it, we really focus on the cultural terrain, how religion, as we call it, as a discourse, science as a discourse. Discourse doesn't just mean language, but it really has to do with the way in which language is deployed, the power that lurks beneath language in order to be used in a certain kind of way. But we're saying that religion and science relate to each other in a post-secular way. In a secular way, which precedes post-secular, as you can probably imagine, religion and science oftentimes are embattled. Science is going to win, or religion should win, something along these lines, to where they're against each other. Or they're completely separate. Religion says something completely different about the world. Science says something completely different. Therefore, never the twain shall meet. There's a lot of different models, but the one we focus on is this one in a post-secular environment where in the secular environment, it's believed often that science or secular things will eventually eradicate religion. It'll go away. Well, that clearly has not happened, despite the pleadings of a lot of people, even today, that they hope religion will go away. I hope it doesn't, frankly. I'd be out of a job, I suppose. But beyond that, functionally speaking, I think religion does wonderful things, right? However, when we think of it as a discourse that is along the same cultural plane as science, they're allowed to coexist with each other in a really kind of interesting way. There'll still be battles, right? But it's not that one is, as we call it, siloed and self-contained, and therefore it fights the other one that's self-contained. They blur, they mix, they use similar terminology, okay? So this is the way in which I kind of prefer to think about it, and just kind of keep in mind as we're talking that if you focus on the truth of a proposition, ask yourself in a difficult way perhaps, are you able to jump from the proposition itself that's true or false to something that is capitally true out in reality that is purportedly referring to? Okay, thank you.
All right, so, wow.
Hello, can you guys hear me? No?
We now have time for discussion with the panelists. I'm going to start things off with inviting you to ask questions of each other. So based on your presentations, are there any questions that Josh, you would like to ask Jeff, and that Jeff, you would like to ask Josh?
Yeah, I actually do. So your last point about them being totally separate or in battle, I guess there's like another place where there's like a symbiosis maybe. I wonder if you've thought about that. Specifically, I feel the symbiosis in my personal life as a scientist. I can talk about that in a moment. But also, I think there's something about the Christian worldview that did lay some of the preconditions for early scientists. I mean, most of them, more than half of them were actually like monks and deeply involved, religious people. And Christianity kind of lays some of the preconditions to actually do science too. So I don't know if you thought about that.
Absolutely. No, it's true. And capitalism and other things that are not typically related to religion or Christianity. And Islam, as I taught today in the world religions class, the golden age of Islam is serious about science. It still is. It just was submerged for 600 years by colonialism. But without any question, that also makes it much more difficult to separate the two from a historical point of view. But the way in which secularization theory went in the 60s and 70s was to argue that they're really separate and can't we get beyond the superstition? So therefore, and even the new atheist movement, which I'm actually opposed to, is labels religion in a very simplistic way in order to then dismiss it on more of a thin notion of religion, which is just belief in
I guess I would just say that there's two extreme views. One is that they're in conflict.
Right.
Another one is that they're just totally separate domains.
Right.
But I think that ignores the actual history of it. They've been quite intertwined
Yes.
and often symbiotic.
I think that's one huge piece. I think even more profound is the way in which they're actually operating culture today. That's one piece that tells you that they can relate to each other in culture today, as opposed to, I mean, again, on the cultural plane, it still doesn't mean that you can't make them separate. It's just a different way of relating to religion and science as discourses, as opposed to things out there that are in battle with each other. But the historical piece is a very clear one that helps make that post-secular point, I think.
Do you have a question for Josh?
Yeah. Well, what do you think about what I said about the truth being really reduced down to propositions, and therefore it's much more difficult to then relate it to corresponding to something in reality?
Yeah, so I would point out that I'm not a hard physical scientist. I'm more in biology. And so they call biology the postmodern science for this reason, because every single rule we discover, there is always several exceptions. Which is and you guys are knowing it. You're like nodding your heads. It's like totally bedeviling. And so, and it's not that these are like unimportant exceptions. These are like fundamentally important exceptions. And so that's why they call it the postmodern science. So there's this real clear sense that the models that we have to describe biological systems are imperfect, and that imperfect is the deeply problematic. But at the same time, we think that there is something going on. It's just that we can't fully access it. So we think that there is some sort of truth out there, at least if we define or question it in a precise way.
Okay.
But
so the imperfections don't necessarily mean that you can't eventually discover the full truth of it? I mean, it's more like quantum mechanics where there's a real limit to what we can actually ever get at with truth. I mean, quantum physics is the same kind
I
of
guess
issue
it'd be
going.
similar to that. So like in a biological system, it's just profoundly complex, and it's full of exceptions to rules. And those exceptions to rules end up becoming really important to understanding things. But at the same time, and so that means any model we make, whether it be a biological experimental model or a computational model or even just like a cartoon diagram, is going to have fundamental flaws to it. But it's also going to have a domain of applicability. Mm-hmm. And even though our knowledge is imperfect, it might be useful knowledge still. And so that's kind of what we hope for.
Okay. Can I do a follow-up real quick? So for instance, on the final slide that you had, there's a proposition that is meant to be assented to by Christians as a proposition. And that proposition, I would argue, is either true or false, no question about that. It's a bigger one to say it is referring and corresponding directly to an event that is meant to represent. Does that make sense? And I'm problematizing
so
that.
So how could it be false? I mean, I'm not sure entirely how you can separate those things. So if it's true, that means that there was some event that happened. Now, maybe there's some ambiguity in the language and disagreement. And maybe so like when I say those words, I mean when someone else says it's something. Is that what you're talking about?
Not quite, no. I mean...
So if we agree on the definition of those words, either it happened or it didn't, right?
True. I guess there's still an issue. Like, I guess when we say something's true, to me, it can only really be reduced down to propositions that are true or false. Now, when you say something happened, you wouldn't say it's true. It happened. But when we talk about capital T truth as a set of events, for instance, that then moves into a proposition which can then be true or false, that's a different kind of thing. And you may not be arguing that the truth is the same in the proposition and the event. Does that make sense? To say it happened, well, that is a proposition which is true or false.
So what's the difference between something happening and actually being the truth that happened?
Because the truth of something happening, or like, again, let's just say for the sake of argument that 2,000 years ago, Jesus was crucified and rose 3 days later. A set of events. So I wouldn't say that is true. That event is true. It happened purportedly, but it's a statement about it, and oftentimes that statement, I mean, it could correspond, but again, there are, let's say, a bunch of people watching it. Well, it depends on which gospel you read. But that would generate different kinds of statements off that.
I see where you're coming. So I think you're using a different Yeah, so I would say correct. I think that would be
Okay.
correct in that use of the word true. And I think then I would probably tend to agree with. I think you're meaning true in more sense of like, is that like a faithful representation of a reality? Like,
Yeah.
would that actually bring you to a relationship with God, for example?
I would say that it's just that, like, for instance, when you hear absolute truth is out there, that's where I get a little squeamish because, again, it's just a proposition that's either true or false. And you may not be arguing this as well. It may be corresponding to something that actually happened, but to call that, and you may not be doing, I may be accusing you of something that you're not.
No, but I think this is actually a point. So so the way I see it, the things that happened, that those were actually things that happened, that is part of truth, okay?
Okay.
Now, so this might be definitional, right?
Sure,
So,
it could be.
but I mean, that's just kind of part of what I'm working with. And I think that's actually part of the underlying thing behind science. Like, there's no point in doing an experiment unless there's something stable out there to discover. And so there's like some belief that not everything is absolute truth, but there is some truth out there that you're going to discover, or there's really no point in doing science.
Right. When I said like grass is green, I mean, there's this thing we call grass and this thing we call green, and we put them together. Hopefully, yeah.
So there's some sense of that kind of implicit in presuppositions
Okay.
into science, and I don't know how you get around that. I mean, I know that scientists will argue against that sometimes, but I just don't know why you'd even do science if you don't believe that there's anything to discover. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, anyways, we could probably talk for a lot longer. You probably have your own questions.
All right. Well, I didn't expect to be the person pressing you both on science and how it might be limited in what it can actually tell us, but I'm going to do that. There's a famous scientist at Harvard, E.O. Wilson, and I was just watching a video that he was on the other day where he very quickly dismissed both religion and philosophy as failures. And so we should just turn to science instead. He knows a lot about ants, right? But he also invented sociobiology, and that's the application of Darwinian analysis to social systems. So for social scientists, this is kind of a hegemonic move by someone from the hard sciences coming in. But he's quite certain that science can provide these answers. Like, who would you marry? Maybe a better understanding of our evolutionary psychology is what can provide the answer for that and provide meaning for life. So why is E.O. Wilson wrong?
So his point is just that science can't answer all these things.
Yes.
I mean, I would just like to see him propose an experiment to tell that will show us why eugenics is wrong. Like, why is that wrong? Other than that, we've all agreed that it's wrong. I mean, like doing a poll, it doesn't establish that it's wrong. I mean, we think it's wrong even if the majority of people think it's right. So how is he going to show us that that's wrong? How is he going to show us that racism is wrong? I mean, what's the experiment that he's going to do to that? And that's like such fundamental problems in our society that if science can't even answer that, I mean, it should call that claim into deep doubt, I would argue.
We have to be careful about separating science and its activity and its technique and its success with naturalism as an ideology that's a separate explanatory model. I trust E.O. Wilson's more talking in naturalistic terms, i.e. we'll be able to explain the things that religion and philosophy have purportedly been able to do eventually with a material explanation for it. You know, again, we could eventually break it down onto why you should marry person X and person Y. If we can figure out why certain neurons are firing at different times when you see this person or that person. I mean, is that part of, Sam Harris makes a similar argument. There's a lot of people that make that argument. But that, while there's science, I guess, involved in that, it really has to do with the ideology that lurks beneath that kind of statement. So really what we're talking about is naturalism versus supernaturalism mixed with the natural world to some extent. He's rejecting, it sounds like, any, not only supernatural explanation for these things, but also floaty philosophical concepts that aren't grounded in the material world to some extent, which I, as my profession should indicate, I disagree with that very fiercely, so yeah.
But I mean, I think like the new atheists and the naturalists, they have a fundamental problem with morality and ethics. It is so important for society. There's no way to approach that scientifically.
But again, I don't think a naturalist is necessarily looking to science to show how to act properly or improperly. And this is where I would say religious studies and philosophy comes in. I mean, ethicists that are atheists have come up with, you know, all kinds of ways to talk about why we know this is the right thing and wrong thing to do without recourse to theology or the supernatural. We could talk about that.
But it's certainly not science that they're using to get there.
It's not, but it's reason. It's reason, and it's which is related to science, but all kinds of other things. So I think science is a narrower category that then can act as a straw man to some extent, and then say, okay, E.O. Wilson is somewhat doing this with religion and philosophy. You build it, and new atheists do it with religion too, to some extent. You build the straw man, then you can knock it down, but they're not actually characterizing, I think, what social scientists, for instance, are doing, which is not the hard sciences, but social science are doing to talk in general about ethics that necessarily does not need recourse to God.
Well,
It
certainly,
may.
but that's a different issue. I didn't
Sure.
say you necessarily need religion to talk about ethics. I'm just saying science doesn't get you to ethics. There's
Right.
just no way to even approach it.
Well, for instance, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, is not looking at science, but he's using reason to argue for a very robust moral system in his Second Critique. And so, these are philosophers that have done that, and his system has been upheld as one major branch of ethics, or a way to look at it, right?
Well, certainly, but that's not science.
No,
this
it's
is my
not.
point. So,
True.
so maybe there's ways to approach ethics that doesn't include religion, but includes reason. But reason alone is not modern science. Like that's like,
Oh, great, agreed, yeah.
there's like a very strong line in the sand. Like reason alone is not science. There's got to be
I agree.
some sort of empirical point.
Sure.
So I'm not. I agree. Like they're trying to take naturalism, which is a philosophy and a metaphysics, and basically put the label of science
Right.
on it to
Right.
give it credibility and say we trust in science for all these things. But as soon as you start getting to the ethical world, they're kind of departing from science and going now into something that is clearly not science.
I agree.
So that's I guess the biggest argument I'd have with them.
A point that you brought up, Josh, is about the perhaps opposition between religion and science. And you think about someone like Nietzsche and his rather famous claim in the book The Gay Science that God is dead. And I've always interpreted that to actually be it's obviously not a historical claim that there once was a God and then finite creatures crawled up to heaven and killed him or something. That's not what he's saying, but instead more that Western philosophy and also Christianity in a way has overcome itself, that Christianity prepared the way for science, but then with its approach, with an honest study of the natural world and an assumption that there's a rational God behind it, they've found order. And then by seeing order, they were able to explain things naturalistically, and therefore that destroyed the basis for faith, but it's robbed the world of miracles. And so do you see that at work? And how does it affect your own research? How does your faith affect your research if you don't think that the two are opposed?
Okay, that's going to take a lot to answer. Do you want to take a crack at it first?
Yeah, would you reframe the question to me or not?
Sure. Are religion and science opposed? And also there is this kind of historical claim as well. Did Christianity sort of prepare the way for the attacks on itself by removing miracles from the world now that we have more and more naturalistic explanations of things?
Right. I think to some extent, yes, if you want to reduce Christianity down to just miracles, although the grand one, right, as you correctly say, that if you remove that one, I think you're correct, it'd be difficult to call oneself Christian. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a part of what Nietzsche's saying. But again, he was also moving in terms of culture, like when he says, we have killed him, it's Christendom that has done this as a society, in addition to the perhaps unintentional byproducts of the Christian way in which it's beginning to understand the world, which then disenchants the world to some large extent, thereby removing the possibility for supernatural things to be believed anymore, except to go back 2,000 years ago. Well, that happened. But the disenchanted world, this is one of Max Weber's points, sociologists as well. So no, I agree that it has unwittingly sowed the seeds of its own destruction to some extent. And I think the God that Nietzsche's talking about, it's not necessarily referring to a metaphysical God out there, has probably effectively been killed by us. And he's really talking about the idea of God that has then bears back down on the Christian world, that idea of God. There are postmodern theologians that say, good, that God needed to die. Now we can start to really talk about religion and theology in an honest way. So there's different moves off of that, right? There was that Time magazine cover, I think in 1967, Is God Dead? There was a surge of death of God theology in the 60s and early 70s that was drawing on Nietzsche's idea, but there was a fundamental misunderstanding from the public to say, how could they talk about God being dead? But just to be clear. So no, I largely agree with that statement.
Yeah, so I guess it gets complicated when you throw in the Nietzsche statement, but I think for me, I mean, I can talk about kind of how I've evolved a little bit as I've been a science in my faith even. So, I mean, I grew up in a faith tradition which really emphasized a lot of like miraculous acts of God in everyday life. But one thing that I think science has shown me, even as I look at it historically, that, I mean, not all Christians have really seen it that way. A lot of Christians have been more towards a scale of deism. Now, I'm not necessarily a deist. I think that God can and is and be involved in events here now, but I just don't think it's nearly as frequent as I was taught earlier. I think that a big part of how God works is through laws he's put into effect, like both physical laws, like, you know, gravity, entropy, things like that. And then also even like social laws and like just the way how like interactions with people work. And that's part of, I mean, that's usually how he ends up working out his will. Now, does that mean he never intervenes? I mean, I don't know how to prove that he never intervenes, and I'm open to that. So I'm not really a deist in that regard who would really argue strongly against that, but I'm way more comfortable talking about God affecting his big portions of his will through laws he's put in effect rather than intentional interventions in history, if that makes sense.
Well, how does your faith affect your own scientific work?
So I think one piece of what I talked about before is that I actually, because of my Christian faith, I actually believe that there is stuff out there in the world and that it honors God to discover it. Like I'm not actually doing something sacrilegious by understanding the physical world. And I mean, it actually really does feel like a worshipful act when I discover something new and I put energy and effort into it. So that's really encouraging, honestly, because that's the other piece of it, because that's when there's a success that feels worshipful. But at the same time, I mean, if you ever go do research, one thing you'll find out really quickly is that it's really a lot of struggle and failure. It's primarily failure, because most of our ideas and intuitions about the world are totally wrong. And the only way you would know by is doing experiments. So you do a lot of experiments that just don't work out. That's kind of how it is. And usually, when you first get into the field, you have really bad intuitions. And so all of your ideas don't work out, and you end up being really, really depressed about this. And I think part of what my faith
Then
did,
you need God.
yeah, honestly, you do in a way. But I guess there's a sense of like, it's not like this is my only identity being a scientist, that there's more to me than just finding out scientific things. So maybe this is really challenging, but it doesn't have to be quite such a cut to the core of who I am. Also, just a belief that even though this is really difficult, there's actually something out there to discover. So maybe I haven't found it yet, but there's at least something out there. It's not like I'm poking around in the sand trying to find gold, and we know for a fact, and we don't really know if there's anything out there. It kind of gives me a little bit of an irrational belief that there's something out there. I mean, there's no way to get that from science either. I mean, you kind of just have to take that by faith. I mean, every scientist takes that by faith when they do an experiment.
Yeah, I mean, I think some would say that not only the rise of science, but some of the big scientific discoveries that at least decentered a traditional interpretation of the way the world works and who we are in the universe. And again, I'd go back to Copernicus and Darwin as two of the big ones. There is the skeptic that would say, how many more of these discoveries that really run counter to certain religious worldviews have to happen until you will finally give up that it's actually God's plan working underneath it or God's law? I mean, you see what I'm saying? Like there seems to be a progression, not necessarily that science will be able to explain everything. At the same time, too, the implications, and we talked about this in my class, the implications of the theory of evolution, whether you hold that it's fact or not, are jarring, right? I mean, they're difficult. Not to say that one can't accommodate that into one's religious faith, but it's not that science has necessarily become less of a problem for religion. To me, it's become a problem for at least holding onto a classic worldview, and to where, I mean, what you're saying that perhaps you're discovering God's law like lurking underneath, I mean, that can't be disproven necessarily whether that's really what's going on or not. However, that's a relatively recent way in which Christians and
Well,
most
see,
people
I would
believe
actually say that that's not true. I would say the view that biblical interpretation is in direct conflict with scientific understanding is actually relatively recent.
True.
And but that became dominant in American evangelicalism, and so now American evangelicalism is taking more of the more recent, like, kind of harmony type of view. But they're recovering something that's actually quite old. You can see it in the early scientists, even in Darwin's day. It was kind of a non-event when scientists put it forward. A lot of theologians were opposed to it, but a lot were like, okay, we can accommodate, it's not that big of a deal. But for me, even just going back even farther to reading like Augustine and hearing how he was dealing with the scientists of his day and how he's thinking about it theologically, I mean, that's like kind of been more the default historically. It's just, I think it's a little bit of a quirk of history that American evangelicals during the 1900s took this up as like a fight. That's kind of the quirk.
Yeah, fair enough.
I would argue.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see it that way too?
Yeah, I do. I do. I think, for instance, Augustine was certainly dealing with Aristotle's geocentric universe, and whether he would have been, in his mind, problematized by Copernicus' discovery, we don't know. But the fact that we now, though, we're not the center of the universe, at least in a physical sense, and that there's billions of stars out there, the possibility of, not only possibility, but high probability of other life somewhere out there, there's a relativization of the human race that's gone on. It doesn't necessarily mean that faith can't continue along with that. It's just, it's one that I wonder if a lot of religious people have really reckoned with the implications of
Yeah, but see, with Augustine, what I really like is even at that, he's like before even modern science is around, right? And like all the scientists around them were wrong about stuff too. Like his attitude towards science is like, you know, if they discover stuff that contradicts like what we think we understand scientifically from the Bible, from the Bible, is we should be really open to changing our interpretation. It'd be really silly not to. It'd be actually kind of stupid because these are really just different volumes of the same book. So there's like the natural volume, and then there's like the revealed volume, right? So Revelation, and then, you know, natural law, and they're kind of the same thing. So clearly we're interpreting this wrong if it's so clearly differently in the other one. And he was just really okay with that. And so I think it's just a different approach where, like, I don't think his natural point was that, oh, is there going to be a conflict? He's like, well, there won't be a conflict. We just have to come to a better understanding. And I expect to actually come to a better understanding of Scripture as scientists kind of figure stuff out. And that was kind of his attitude. And that's been the attitude of lots of Christians throughout history. And I feel like, yeah, I get that it's relatively new within the American evangelical tradition, which I'm part of. But, I mean, I feel like it's actually much older than evangelicalism, and that's why I'm really comfortable with it. So, I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does, totally.
I guess one more question I have is, can you think of any physical phenomena that you think actually require a kind of spiritual explanation? That is, if you, not just more, we're not talking about miracles, but things that we observe in ordinary everyday life that you could not, if you just adopted a purely mechanistic, materialistic approach to understanding this world, it would be insufficient. I
think it's going to be a very hard statement to like prove, but I guess there's a couple of things that suggest something bigger. So I point to a lot of C.S. Lewis's writings about kind of like you know, we usually yearn for things that exist. Like we yearn, when we're hungry for something that actually exists. People do seem to have yearnings for things that don't seem satisfiable in the physical world. And that seems very curious. Now you can come up with some physical explanations for why that's there. As a Christian, I really believe that those yearnings are actually implanted by God to point us to Him. And they really do, they're yearning for something that's unsatisfiable here on earth, that's only satisfiable by Him. Now, there are physical explanations, like Darwinists would come up with, like, you know, basically misfiring, you know, desires and things like that. And that's possible. I can't prove it to you that's what it is, but that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know, how would you say it?
Well, Jeff, since you're in a philosophy department, I'll go ahead and ask you, what about consciousness? This is the big one.
Right.
You have people like Thomas Nagel, who's not in any way a theist, but he's recently argued that there's no mechanistic or materialistic plausible explanation for the basic brute fact that we all experience every day, which is our own consciousness. And so he's tried to say that there must be some kind of teleological explanation, where others like Alvin Plantinga could say, no, it's God, right? So what do you make of this debate going on within kind of your own discipline, even though you're in religious studies?
Right. Yeah, I think Nagel's book is incredibly interesting, and while you say he's not a theist, it certainly was jumped on by a lot of theists to say, see, like Plantinga,
right, yeah.
Which is fine. But I think Nagel's idea is not even necessarily in conflict with Darwin's theory to some large extent. It's just that he's kind of adding this thing that is not able to be explained through mechanistic evolution. Totally fair. I mean, I think that's fantastic, and I think it's actually probably a more accurate explanation for how we are human beings and not acting like dogs that are operating on instinct. There's something else going on that's very clear. I think recourse to then move it into it must be God implanted, I mean, I would stop the train there myself. However, I can understand how someone would jump on that, but I think Nagel is operating not only within logic, he's inferring that there has to be something beyond mechanical evolution to explain things like consciousness and the means by which we have morality and understand ourselves. So I think Nagel's book is fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we open up to the audience for questions.
If you have any questions, please come down. I'll hold the microphone. And yeah, we'd love to hear whatever questions you guys have for Dr. Scholes and Dr. Swamidas on the nature of truth. Is science enough? So feel free to make your way. Be that brave person. Oh, wonderful. This is convenient.
Yeah. Can I get a stole this? Do you mind? It's just because you're going to yank it away from me in a moment. Yeah. Yeah, so first of all, I just wanted to comment. There's an old adage that says whenever a conversation mentions Hitler, the intellectual premise is gone. And I'd like to thank you for doing that within the first 5 minutes and misrepresenting probably the second most famous personality in the planet. Hitler was a self-identified Christian, and there are numerous quotes of his that back that up. And Stalin, in fact, spent most of his adolescence in theological schools. As opposed to you.
So, I mean, first of all, let me stop you there and just make a quick response to that. So, Hitler claimed to be a Christian. He was like a master of like appropriating symbols from different religions. He like the swastika symbol is
from Hindu. Is from India.
Yeah, so he was a master marketer. I mean, no Christian has ever claimed Hitler as their own. I don't know if you've heard of the if you've heard of the church movement that was happening in Germany at the time. And I'm forgetting the name of that movement.
German Christians, right, is what loosely called German Christians, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, so I understand that you're trying to kind of tar Christians really by associating with Christians, but Christians have never claimed that he's a Christian. He was rejected by Christians there. That's just too far of a thing to go by. But we'll move on past that point to your next one.
I will grant you, and my entire point was, by your own admission, the only thing that was required to be a Christian is accepting of that one statement you put up there. As long as Hitler did that.
Well, no, actually, that's not the whole thing. That's the center of it. There's more to being a Christian than that. I mean, I could explain.
That's actually not what you said, but never mind. I'll grant you that. My second point is when you're answering the question, when you come here and you proclaim yourself a Christian, it's basically like I find it that you're asking basically a carpet salesman if hardwood floors are enough. He's not going to answer yes. You have a preconceived notion of what is needed here. That's just a personal comment. I don't think you're quite, if your starting point is Christianity as a necessity for life, then of course you're not going to answer science is enough. In terms of
So all you're saying is that I'm living a life consistent with what I've told you, so that's true. So
what I'm saying is that your base point for whether or not science is necessary is faith, not reason. And this leads into my second point when you say that science can argue morality. Let's take the topic of
Well, first of all, I did not say that. So, I mean, you're putting a lot out there. So, I mean, you should really make your your next statement should be the most important question you want to ask us, because this can't be like dominated by this entire discussion. We can talk afterwards, but you should make your most important question right now.
Right. So it's basically just you're saying science can't argue morality. But for eugenics, for instance, establishing the facts surrounding eugenics, we could easily conceive a situation where eugenics would be beneficial in some way or another.
Okay, all right. I was wondering, what's the question there?
The question is, I don't agree with the premise, and as you argued, Sam Harris does very eloquently in his book, Can Science Answer Moral Questions, argue that indeed if we do have...
Okay, so I got your question. Yeah, thanks. I would just argue that you're making my point, that if you're going to take science alone, there's no way to argue against eugenics, which I think is really scary. Go ahead.
Sure. My name is Joshua. Thank you, Dr. Swamidas and Dr. Scholes, for your insightful talks. The last Veritas Forum I went to was actually on the topic of scientism, and the idea that you can exalt science to something that is both your religion, your worldview, and everything you need to live by, which I think would answer our topic for this evening by saying, yes, science is enough for everything we need. But C.S. Lewis also said that good philosophy needs to exist if for no other reason than to answer bad philosophy. So what would you say? Can you think of any examples, colleagues you might have, arguments you've seen that are good examples of calling out when science goes too far or when people exalt it? And potentially as a starting point for discussion, could you go back to eugenics and talk about Europe today? I would argue that, you know, it's not just a thing of the past, but when 80% of Down syndrome fetuses are aborted and targeted in Europe, does that still qualify as eugenics? And how do you say that's not a value statement anymore when science is saying that's the best way to operate society?
So what I'm going to say now might be really controversial to some of the scientists in the room, but I just think if you look historically, it's really dangerous if we leave scientific ethics only up to scientists. I think it's got to be a larger societal discussion. And these questions are really challenging to deal with in a pluralistic society, because we can't just say go to the Bible and see what it says, and that's what we should do. It's not, I mean, I'm not actually advocating that either. I mean, I'm just saying that ethics is, I mean, there's so much potential to injure people, and especially vulnerable people that don't have power and who don't have voice. And I, as a Christian, think that that is horribly wrong. We need to be really careful about that. And sometimes just that curiosity that drives science, if it's not checked by an equally strong like pushback to protect people, it can really lead to really dangerous things. So that's all
I'll just say this too as a plug for philosophy. I mean, one of the major branches of philosophy is ethics, and we have someone in our department who does medical ethics, and there's an incredibly long history of reasoning out what is considered ethical, but at least problematizing these kinds of questions. Sometimes with recourse to religion, sometimes not. So it's not that philosophers have ever left it just up to scientists, ever. So there's just a very long history of
But scientists have often been able to work without checks.
That's a problem. I agree with you completely.
I mean,
but it's ethicists that come in and ask very difficult questions and think and write on these subjects, sometimes from a religious point of view, sometimes not. But it's been going on for thousands of years. I mean, so.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a complicated question to totally get into. Sorry, we should probably do another forum on on eugenics. I didn't realize.
Right.
You know.
Boy.
Okay. Tucker, that's my name. And
Hi, Tucker.
Hi. I forgot your name.
Josh.
Hi, Josh. I was going to ask, you brought up a point that historical facts are not really scientific facts. I agree. But the question I have for you is, why would you base your life around a historical fact? So say, for instance, I could believe or not believe that the Holocaust happened, but it's not really going to change how I live my life. However, like believing in the historical Jesus and the resurrection of him, that's going to have great impact on your life, whether you believe it or not. So I'm saying, what is your basis for believing something that obviously is not scientific, so we don't really know. I mean, I'm not saying we know for sure if science knows, but we have a better idea if it's scientific. And it doesn't, and you know, the Iliad and other texts state a lot of things historically. What's your basis for basing your life around a historical fact?
That is an excellent question. And I'll give you a chance to respond too. So I mean, I mean, it's necessarily just for me, but I think that the claims of Christianity are centered on that. It's kind of like the proof that is offered that the revelation through Jesus is real. Okay, now that revelation of Jesus is so profound that if you actually choose to accept it, it's going to make a big difference in your life either way. And from my point of view, I mean, and actually one of the philosopher or scientist I read that made the biggest impact on me, this is Pascal. If you actually read through the stuff he talked about. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the exact phrasing of his wager, but the whole point is that if these claims are really true, you really should be living according to it. If these claims aren't true, then you shouldn't be. I mean, this is not like a neutral statement. And all we have to go on is not scientific facts, but that's historical facts. So you have to kind of start approaching it with the tools of like historical inquiry and looking at like eyewitness accounts, what you think is plausible, if this actually makes sense for the conception of God that you can come to. I mean, and for me, when I look at all of that, that's where it started from, to kind of think, this really doesn't make sense that he was just kind of befuddling everyone. For me, really, if there is a God out there, if there exists a God that could break physical laws if he wanted to, this seems like a pretty good way to make his point. And not only that, you know, it was compelling to me. I mean, I can't fully make the case right this second, though I would point to like a book by Francis Collins to kind of explain that a little bit more clearly. That was really close to my path. And then, so that's where it started, and then it came to actually kind of coming to is what I would call admittedly a subjective, I can't prove it to you, relationship with God that seems real. And so, I mean, it's kind of, that's kind of like this building personal history I have with it that kind of transcends that like more intellectual argument too. So that's kind of where I am now. Do you want to add anything? Or, I mean, I know you probably come from a different spot, but that's okay.
Right. Yeah, I guess all I would say is that it's kind of one of the classic Christian claims is from say Tertullian early on is I believe because it's absurd, and not only Pascal's wager but even Kierkegaard's leap of faith. They're sort of prioritizing the Christ event as that which is so radical, paradoxical, all these other things that if one enters into it, it must be transformative, as you say. But you know, of course, a Muslim would say the same thing about Muhammad receiving the first revelation in the cave. I mean, this is, you know, also supernatural, miracle, shocking, stunning. So I think that claim to, when a Christian attempts to demystify the event to some degree by searching for the historical Jesus, and you're not saying this, I think you run into the problem of pluralism of other religions that are making different kinds of miraculous claims about revelation. So in other words, why is this so special? And the Muslims have an answer for that. Well, that didn't happen, or it didn't happen quite like that. There's some things that are true. So I'll just throw that one out there as to relativize to some extent that historical idea.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Tucker, for your question. Next question here.
Hey, I'm Nathan, and do you believe that events are because of causes, right? Every event is because of a cause.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe.
Oh.
I mean, is every event caused
So you're
by
not,
something?
Yeah, are you a determinist?
Who are you asking? I can't see.
Him.
Oh.
I mean, I don't know.
You don't know if you're a determinist?
I don't know what you mean by that exactly.
Oh, determinist is someone who believes that every event happened because of a cause, and since everything happened because of a cause, there must be no choice.
Oh, I certainly don't agree with that.
All
That's
right,
not
so
quite determinism either.
Why do you believe that
Yeah.
things can happen without a cause?
But wait a minute, I can believe in choice. I mean, I think a choice is a cause. So, I mean, I don't know really. You're the philosopher. Can you explain this question to me better?
I mean, determinism as an ideology is much more broad than that. I mean, a free will person who's a compatibilist, you know, along with things that are determined in the physical world, that still free will is able to make choices that run counter to a strict deterministic world, can still hold that, yeah, I mean, I'm picking up this water bottle that had this is an effect that had a cause, me picking it up, of course, right? But at the same time, too, I chose to do it. So there's tricky things about what caused the free will. Does that make sense? So determinism as an ideology is different from then just saying just because something has a cause, and you agree with that statement that you're a determinist.
But what was the cause of you picking up the bottle?
Right, it's multiple. There's countless causal factors for that. Yeah. I decided
But also, I would point out that the big surprise in physics is that physical systems are not deterministic. And that's deeply embedded in quantum mechanics. Like, they're fundamentally not deterministic. That was a big surprise. And so if you're going to go for the hard determinism based on science, I mean, you have a problem there.
But how does quantum physics then render choice? Isn't it just
I'm not saying that quantum physics renders choice. I'm just saying that it just becomes problematic to take that extremely strict view. I mean, I think that was more of a product of like finding, you know, like the laws of gravity and all these deterministic laws. But then when you get down to quantum mechanics, it's not there. I don't know how choice interfaces all this. I mean, but that's more for the philosophers to debate, I imagine.
Sure. We don't have enough time.
Hi, I'm Rick. You let old people ask questions. I was a graduate student like 6 years ago. My question came with the moderator, and then you kind of backed that up, but the idea that Christianity sowed the seeds for its own destruction in the scientific method, because then it ruled out miracles. I guess based on your definition of science, I don't see how science could rule out an actual miracle. It maybe squash some superstitions that were attached. But can science really rule out miracles? It's not in its purview, isn't it?
I guess it gets down to the nature of what a miracle is, right?
Right, and what science is as well. I mean, for a scientist, the purview and the jurisdiction of a scientist, you're right about that, right? I mean, can you rule out a miracle for scientists or anyone? No, within science itself, right? However, scientists would probably not argue that they're looking at trying to prove that miracles happen, because you're dealing with the natural world, not the supernatural entering in.
And I will borrow from your linguistic theory to say that miracles mean very different things in different
True.
contexts. So, like, some people will say, I saw my child being born, that was a miracle. And in the way they mean it, it actually is a miracle. But that's not really a violation of physical laws,
Yeah.
right? So I think when people say
Right.
miracles,
I meant supernatural intervention.
Sure.
yeah, but even the choice to kind of call it that is kind of framed as a response to science, right? So
When people say science has shown miracles can't happen, they're talking bull.
Right, it has not precluded the possibility of miracles. You're right, I agree. I
I
agree.
mean, it's taken by faith, essentially, that there is
Right.
no miracles. You kind of assume
If the
that
Cowboys
there's,
win the Super Bowl, I would consider that a miracle, but certainly within the realm of, natural
physical
events
laws of the
happening,
universe.
right?
Cool.
No, I mean, I would agree with you. I think it really comes down to, like, the claim, at least as far as Christians are concerned, is that there is like there's a personal God that will occasionally intervene in history in a way that might be counter to physical laws. I don't know how you do an experiment for that exactly, because it's not repeatable, right? It might be observable as a single event, but you'd have no idea if it was measurement error. There's no way to repeat it. It's a call for that violation on command. And if you could do it reliably, you would just call it like a physical law. So, I mean, I agree with that point.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I think we'll take these two last questions. So we have Robert.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I've noticed a lot in the past few years especially that there's been an increasing sort of polarization between people who are people of faith and people who believe in the mysterious concept of science or whatever they're calling that. And I'm wondering what you think causes that. You both seem to be people that agree that you can be a Christian and a scientist without violating anything. But what do you think is causing that battle that's sort of looking in?
I say back to our dinner discussion, politics and the culture war, frankly, and the media that, again, when I kind of crack this joke that Republicans are against science, whatever that means, I mean, for instance, if that line is believed, then it has political cachet, and we already know our polarized political world, then you just throw science kind of into it, and then before you know it, science is on one side, religion is on the other side. But it has nothing to do, to my mind, again, with the level of cultural discourse where they are intertwined on many, many levels. It's just that they get polarized because they get politicized to a large extent. That was what I was at.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's people who are trying to pick fights to promote their worldviews, whether it be political or like the new atheists would be an example. And even there's, I would call the intelligence design crowd like Christians trying to pick fights too. So, I mean, to promote their worldview. I mean, it's just, I think there's so much power behind both religion and like the word Christian and the word science that there's things called Christian scientists that are neither Christians nor scientists, And I think these are terms that are used to kind of lend credibility. So actually, Fenneman has like a term for this. It's called cargo cult science. So it's this idea. So it kind of goes back to like World War II. These Polynesian islanders saw like all of these Americans kind of coming in and like doing stuff, and they were totally impressed by them. And they just figured that if they made like an airfield, and they kind of started like acting like soldiers, then like planes would come to give them cargo. And of course it didn't work because they didn't actually get how it was working. They were kind of just putting on the trappings of being an American and being in the military, but without really understanding it. And so he argues that there's all these pseudosciences that kind of take the trappings of science to get the credibility of science. And I think that's totally true. And I think it's the same thing with Christianity. I think there's a lot of things out there that take the trappings of Christianity to get the credibility of Christianity when they aren't even really Christian. So, and I just think that that's going on, and people are fighting over these things, and I think that's why it's that way.
And our last question. What's your name?
My name's Hope. This question is for Dr. Scholes. I speak as somebody who was raised as a Christian, and probably others who were here heard a lot of just take it by faith. And I'm wondering if in your religious studies you notice certain sects or faiths that are more open to scientific inquiry, or if that just depends on the culture wars and the media and the individual.
I think potentially within all, at least the major world religions, there's openness to science, no question about it. I mean, the Pope Francis just came out, I keep spitting, sorry, with a statement about evolution. It's been in Catholic doctrine for a long time, but he made this public statement that we're cool with evolution. You know, my other colleague, Jeff Ashton, can attest to Buddhism and Hinduism's very quick marriage with scientific discovery. In fact, the claim that Buddhism was actually predicting aspects of quantum mechanics way before it was, quote, discovered. So, you know, there's certainly people within each religion that are hostile to science, as I'm kind of saying it, not necessarily the attempt to understand the world, but what it promotes. The scientism, I think, as one person said. So there's hostility within each group, but I can't make a blanket statement about a religion that's more copacetic with it necessarily.
Well, thanks everybody for your questions. Let's thank Dr. Scholes, Dr. Swamidas, and Dr. Dunn for their time. And 2 quick reminders. Please fill out those comment cards. Again, you can, or if you hand that into those baskets back on the back table, you will have a chance to win an iPad from the Veritas Forum. And secondly, please stick around for the food and the drink we have, and you'll have the opportunity to talk with our guests. So thank you again for coming. On behalf of CRU and the Veritas Forum, thank you so much.